Alright. I wanted to make a quick video. This is going to be pretty disorganized and messy. I will make maybe a more polished version of this in the future. But for now, I just wanted to quickly actually talk about and explain how the game determines which direction Mario is facing after a twirl with cape, or a spin in general. It uses the same routine for just any time Mario is spinning, whether that be small from a spin jump or big or whatever, or a cape twirl. They all use the same routine to figure out what to do. And the main two things we're going to be looking at are these three tables right here, and there's going to be ASM in this, of course. I'll try to explain it as best as I can, though, and in probably more detail than I have to, but I think this is an interesting enough routine to talk about more or less the whole thing, that everything that it's doing based on this, what we're getting out of this. Just what it does. And there's this isn't the actual start of the routine that I've highlighted. There's some more checks before it, but they're basically irrelevant for our purposes because we're starting with the assumption that Mario is twirling somehow. So the first thing that we see actually is that it's loading in frame counter B, and don't mind the comments too much. They're of varying quality in the disassembly. But frame counter B is address 14, which is an effective frame counter, and this is important for later because the effective frame counter pauses when the game is paused, or if the screen is scrolling, or if sprites are otherwise locked for some reason. So unlike address 13, which is a global frame timer that's always ticking, this one can be stopped by pausing, and that's a distinction that we'll come back to at a future time. But looking back here, it's then ANDing it, a bitwise AND, with 6, which means it's clearing every bit in the timer except for the second and third, or I guess the first and second bits, if you're doing index by 0, whatever. Basically the 2's bit and the 4's bit are the only ones that are preserved, which means that after that operation, the only 4 possible values that can be left are 0, 2, 4, or 6, depending on where the frame counter was at. So if you break up the frame counter, or if you basically do mod 4 or mod 8 of the frame counter, you're going to get a number between 0 and 7, and this basically narrows that down even further to 0, 2, 4, or 6 is the only 4 options. And the frame counter, what it feeds into this routine, will basically be one of those 4, depending on where in its cycle, where in its 8 frame cycle it is. And then it transfers both of that to both X and Y registers for use later, and they're going to be used for different things. We actually get a lot of mileage out of this one frame counter input. Basically, they're used in different ways to index all 3 of these tables. And then some more code that's just kind of running checks that we're already usually assuming. In this case, is Mario flying or is he on the ground? So if he's on the ground, it's going to skip ahead a little. If he's moving downwards, it's going to, or if he's moving upwards, it's going to skip ahead a little. The comment here is actually helpful. But if Mario is falling, what it's instead going to do is increment Y by 1. So Y was either 0, 2, 4, or 6. Now it's either 1, 3, 5, or 7. Depend if he's falling. And the only thing this is actually used for is what pose the actual cape is going to be in if Mario has a cape. We don't know yet whether or not he does have one. So then you can see it loads in the data from our first table, LDA data table address indexed by Y. And if we look at that table, it's this one here, the third one down, the one that goes 2769, 2769. And whatever it gets from there. Oh yeah, so basically the difference is that, if Mario is falling, it's going to increment Y. Otherwise, it is going to keep y as it is, so either 0, 2, 4, or 6. Then use that to read from this table, and then store that to 13df. 13df is this address here, which basically is used if Mario has the cape to show which pose the cape should be in. So, as you can see, 2 and 6 are Mario just standing on the ground with his cape out behind him. It's just two different frames of that it alternates between. Whereas 7 and 9 are the same thing, but for the cape up in the air. This only ever happens if Mario is falling, his cape goes up in the air like that. If he's standing on the ground or if he's rising, then his cape will be at his side, like in 2 and 6. So basically, what this is saying is that based on, let's assume Mario is grounded, and look at the last table here. So if he's grounded, that means we know he's going to be using either 2 or 6. So the frame counter for frames 0 and 1 will use 2. For frames 3 and 4, it'll use 6. For frames 5 and 6, it'll use 2. And for frames 7 and 8, it'll use 6. So basically every 2 frames, it alternates between pose 2 and pose 6 for the actual cape itself, not for Mario. So if he's standing on the ground, it'll alternate between these two, and if he's falling, then it'll alternate between these two. Now, obviously, that's not quite the full story, because Mario doesn't just have his cape out on his left side for the entire duration of a spin. It switches between left and right, and that's going to get into, I think, the next part of this routine. Where were we? Okay, not quite yet, but we'll get there soon. Next, it's going to load Mario's power-up in. So this is basically only checking if he's small or not. If he's small, then it's going to skip this step of incrementing X, which again, currently only has 0, 2, 4, or 6. And if he has anything other than small, it'll keep X as it is. And then it'll basically use that to load from our next table. So if we take a look at that, that's table CEA1, 00 CEA1, so that's going to be our second table here. And you can see the entries are 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 1. And this is going to be what determines his facing direction during every part of his twirl or spin or whatever. So, again, if you're small, then what it's getting out of this versus if you're big doesn't actually change. So, because you're using X to index here, which we just incremented if Mario is not small. If Mario is big or cape or fire flower, it'll be basically it'll read either, depending on frame counter, 0 or 1, 2 or 3, 4 or 5, or 6 or 7. And in all of those cases, it doesn't matter whether or not you're small. It's agnostic to that because they're duplicate entries in the table. So this part, it does not yet matter whether or not you are small. That actually comes into play when we reuse X later. But for now, basically, what you need to understand, and this is probably the most important part of the video, on frame 0 or 1 of the 8-frame cycle, your direction will be 0, which is right. And on just highlight this table, I guess. On frames 2 and 3, it'll be 0. On frames 5 and 6, it'll be 1, or 4 and 5, it'll be 1. And on frames 6 and 7, it'll be 1, so those last 4 being left. So that's the gist of it, is that every 4 frames, you alternate between facing right and facing left. That's the simple part. And notably, again, this will come back into play later, it's very important, the timer that determines whether you're facing left or right is affected by pausing. The timer will not tick if you're paused, and that makes sense that it would use that one, because otherwise Mario would visually keep twirling even while the game is paused, and we don't want that, obviously. But let's keep going through our little routine here. Next, it's going to overwrite what the index we had in Y with Mario's power-up, so we can check if it's 2, which is the cape. So now we're checking if Mario has a cape feather, and This basically isn't super important. If he does, then we run this code here, code 00D044, which basically just handles your cape's hitbox, which isn't important to us. We know that if Mario's cape is on the left of him, then the hitbox is going to be on the left side and vice versa. That's not super relevant. Either way, it's going to converge here at this code. It's still going to have the same index in X that it did before this routine. The cape hitbox routine has no effect on what's in X. So we're then basically going to be loading from our final table based on X, and then jumping somewhere else. So let's take a look at this last table. So remember, the value of X right now is a combination of both our frame counter, where it is in the 8 frame cycle, and whether or not we're small. If we're small, then this got incremented, or this, if we're big, this got incremented by 1. So what this means is that on, for example, frames 0 and 1 of the cycle, if Mario is small, then we'll get 0 in the accumulator, and if he's big, we'll have, again, 0 in the accumulator, no difference. But on frames 2 and 3, depending on whether or not he's big or small, these values will be 25 or 44, and then again 0 or 0. And then on the final 2 frames, it'll be either 0F or 45, depending on whether he's big or small. So what are these numbers used for? Well, if we actually go down to the routine it's jumping to, 00D01A, right here, and you can see this is actually the end of this routine. The first thing it does is check if Mario is actually rotated 45 degrees if he's standing on a triangle, in which case it'll skip, or it'll do all of this weird extra stuff, which we're not concerned with because I don't want to think about triangles right now, honestly. But if you're not in the triangle, then it just skips to the end of this little routine. All it does is store what we had in A down here to Mario's current frame, and then returns, and the routine is done. So what's Mario's frame? Well, if we look at this last little bit here, oh, I was wrong earlier. It's actually 0 faces left and 1 faces right for Mario, as I have here literally referenced on screen that I didn't bother to look at. But if we look down here at the poses that Mario can have, here is all of them, effectively. There are some quirks about how these poses work, because as you can actually see here, poses 0 to 3C may differ in appearance between small, big fire, and cape power-ups. Poses 3D and onwards do not. This is an important distinction, but also one that doesn't entirely make sense to me. So basically our routine here finished up by saying which pose Mario should have, and then while the game is figuring out, setting up which graphics to render for the next frame, it'll take that into account to know what to render to the screen based on the pose that we tell it that Mario is in right now. So again, if we look at this table here, there's no good place for me to put this, alas. So if we look first on frames 0 and 1, it'll either be 0 or 0. So no matter what, pose 0 is being used. So pose 0, since it's within the first 3C entries or 3D entries of this table, this pose is actually dynamic. It's going to be different depending on what's currently loaded into graphics memory. So if you're small, it'll appear small. If you're big, it'll appear big. If you have a cape, it'll appear that you have a cape. And if you're a fire flower, that's just big with a different palette. So it's a dynamic pose that's agnostic to whether you are big or small. So this works for all of those. Then next, it'll use, on frames 2 and 3, it'll use either pose 25 if you're big, or cape or fire Mario, or pose 44 if you are small. So let's look at those two poses. 25, right over here, but Mario, and 44, again, but Mario. The difference being that this one, again, is going to be dynamic depending on which power-up state you have. So if you're small Mario, it'll render him small. And if you're big Mario, it'll render him big. If you have a cape, that's just extra tiles. If you have Fire Flower, that's just a different palette. Now, alternatively, if you are actually big fire or have a cape, it'll use pose 44. And this is a bit odd because 44, this is not a dynamic pose, this is a static pose. So it'll always render this image you see here, just with or without a cape drawn on top of it, or with the palette for Fire Mario, or if you're playing as Luigi, the exact same thing but with Luigi. This makes no sense to me, because maybe I'm misunderstanding how this works, but you could just use pose 25 for both, because it already accounts for whether or not you are big or small. There's no reason to use a separate pose that's static when the dynamic one covers this. And that's the weird quirk with this table. It doesn't serve a purpose, really. It's basically saying use the static table if you are big or cape or fire, or use the dynamic table if you're small, but the dynamic poses should cover every case. So I don't know why it's doing that. And then again, 0, 0 for the next 2 frames. Again, that's this Mario facing right pose. And then for the last 2 frames of the cycle, F or 45, which is this facing the camera one. And again, you guessed it, this static facing the camera one versus this dynamic one. So, same deal. Now, you might have realized that the first and third sets of 2 frames in the cycle use the same pose. And additionally, back here, the first and second halves of the frames use the same poses for the cape behind Mario, and that's because that's affected by your facing direction. It'll use the same pose, but just flipped over the vertical axis, or flipped horizontally, based on your direction. So it's using the same pose for both, but with one you're facing left, and with one you're facing right. But what's important to note about this, actually, is that if we look back at the table, you'll see that for the 4 frames where Mario is facing to the... That's right, facing to the right. References literally... Move it. Right there. And so when Mario's facing to the right, he can either have pose 0 facing to the right, or if I go back to the other diagram, he can have either pose 0 facing to the right, or let's assume that he has a cape. Pose, so that's facing the camera. So we know that for the 4 frames where Mario is either looking to the right or facing the camera, his actual direction that the game uses for its physics calculations is right. And for the other 2, it's going to use pose 0 facing to the left. And for the final set of 2, it's going to use Mario's butt facing the camera. So if his butt is facing the camera, or he's looking to the left, then Mario's true direction is left. So the reason that the frame counter is split up this way, so it can be indexed into these 3 tables to be used in 3 different ways that all handle basically where Mario's cape is pointing, what pose Mario should be drawn in, and what direction he is actually facing for the purpose of physics calculations. So, now that we actually know all of those, there's actually one more thing that I would like to briefly touch on, and again, this will be getting its own more fleshed out video whenever I get around to it, hopefully. But Mario's twirl, when you have a cape, he spins for 18 frames. And since his poses are split up into groups of 2 frames, that means that if you can see the pose that Mario has on the first frame after twirling, you know which pose he's going to have at the end of the twirl. You have that perfect knowledge, effectively. And if I actually go back to the other diagram and look at this table again, this first table we looked at, where his pose is, let's assume he's standing on the ground, will be 2, 6, 2, 6. It'll alternate. But for the first set of 2, 6, he'll be facing to the left, and for the second frame of 2, 6, he'll be facing to the right. Which means that for the second half of frames, he will actually be using 2 and 6 as they're drawn here. But for the first half of the frames, he'll be using 2 and 6, but he's facing to the left, assuming he's standing on the ground. The same thing applies to whether you're flying. It just uses different graphics for it, because you have a different pose. Or no, you have this exact pose while you're twirling while flying, obviously. So what this means is that when Mario is truly facing to the right, his cape will be on the left of him, and when he's truly facing to the left, his cape will be on the right of him. So you can use that with the 18 frame difference to have actually almost perfect knowledge of which pose Mario will be in at the end of his cape twirl. And you can derive from that, because normally, well, let me back up a bit. Just by looking at the cape alone, it's not enough information. Because look right here, we can actually see the difference between 2 and 6. 2 and 6 is quite subtle. It's hard to tell from just a glance which one you have. But we also have to consider the permutation here. Because if Mario's facing to the right, his cape will be in one of these two poses to the left of him, but also he will be in different animation frames. So you see here, 2, he'll have pose 0, and for 6, he'll have pose 25, assuming we have a cape. And if we look at this diagram, that means facing to the side, or facing his butt facing the camera. So we can actually determine, using this pose, where Mario is in his twirl, and know which pose he will have at the end of the twirl. Because 18 is not divisible by 4, we have to use the specific pose, and not just where his cape is, to know where he will be n times 2 frames from now. In this case, n is 9. If it were 4, it'd be... If 18 was instead 16 and divisible by 4, it'd be easier. But basically, if you can have perfect knowledge of which direction you will be facing at the end of a pump just by looking at your pose on the first frame of that turn, of that twirl, and again, I'll go into more detail into this on this in the future. But by looking at what pose you have, you know what pose you will have, and therefore you know what direction you will have at the end of the twirl. And if it's not the direction you want, you could actually do a second twirl 4 frames after your first one. Press X 4 frames after your first X input. And that will effectively start a new twirl that also lasts 18 frames. So you will in total have been twirling for 22 frames, which is enough to invert your position in this table. You know, if you're here, for example, during frames 2 and 3, then instead you will have started here. Your second twirl will start here, guaranteed, at the 0 or at the frames 5 and 6, or sorry, 4 and 5. And therefore, you know it'll end 18 frames later on frames 22 and 23, which basically, again, is frames 4 and 5. I'm messing something up there. I'm tired. Point being that you can invert your facing direction from, in this case, left to right. You know, left to right by doing a second twirl 4 frames after your first one. Now, normally it is impossible for a person to see within the first 2 frames of twirling what pose Mario has specifically, and then react in time to by the 4th frame approximately. There's a little bit of wiggle room depending on where in the cycle you are to invert your facing direction, but do a second twirl in that time to invert your facing direction and get the direction you want if you've decided the direction that you're going to face is not the one you want. However, that's where our friendly... If I scroll down a bit, frame counter B comes in, because this is the one that is not affected, that is affected by pausing. So if you pause the instant you start a twirl, you can see which frame you have and where you are in the cycle, so you therefore know how your twirl is going to end, and you can either unpause and do nothing if you like it, or unpause and then immediately press X again to do a second twirl if you don't like it, to invert your outcome. And when I say pause immediately upon pressing X and then press X again immediately upon unpausing, the amount of delay here, based on just human lag, at least for me, works out to about 4 frames to consistently invert my facing direction. So this is basically a method that has steps to it that I can work through it and demonstrate a process for. It's a state machine, as Nyx put it. How to consistently manipulate your facing direction after a turnaround based on the information you get from pausing as soon as the twirl starts. And I'm probably going to make a more fleshed out video on how that works at some point. This is more or less just the pretext for why that works and how that works, and not necessarily how to do it. But that's it. I'm done. My throat hurts. Goodbye.